Thank you for joining today's webinar on NCPERS semi-annual state and federal legislation webcast. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director of NCPERS. Today's program is part of our expanded Center for Online Learning. As we all adjust to the new COVID reality, please bear with us if there should be any technical issues or unplanned background noise during our session. As always, your patience and understanding is appreciated. Joining me today are our regular contributors, Bridget, Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition, NPPC, and Tony Roda, partner at the law and lobbying firm of Williams Jensen. Today's format will be a moderated conversation with our two panelists, but we will reserve the last part of the program for your questions. Please submit them by using the GoToWebinar portal. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. And Tony, let me start off with you today. Obviously, there's been a number of legislation that have come from Washington, D.C. that impact public pensions. So let's start with one. Can you give us a highlight of the SECURE Act and the provisions that impact public and state and local pensions?
Yes, Hank, happy to do it. Happy to be here with you and Bridget again. I'm just sorry we're not able to be in studio together. That's always a treat. But let me talk about the SECURE Act. That was enacted at the end of 2019, December 20th, in fact, very late in the year. Somewhat of a surprise, but only to the extent of the fact that it rode along an appropriations bill, an end-of-year appropriations bill. The provisions of the SECURE Act were kind of long in the making and had been around in Congress for quite a few years. So there are 5 provisions in the SECURE Act I'm going to touch on. There was a 6th provision in another end-of-year bill, and then there were 2 healthcare related. But in the SECURE Act itself, if you think back, the issue of required minimum distributions and the fact that, you know, with increased longevity, people were kind of chafing under the fact that they had to begin these required minimum distributions, or RMDs, by age 70 and a half, or in the year following that. So in the SECURE Act, that age was increased to 72 for those who turned 72 beginning in 2020. So that's a big change. It happened late in the year. There were certainly practical considerations on how to implement that, but the plans were able to get that information out and deal with it. Be aware that Congress, yes, Hank?
Just a clarification, you said at 72. Is it 72 or is it 75? It was 72?
72.
Okay, great,
yeah,
thank you.
The SECURE Act moved this to 72. Be aware, though, that there's legislation pending that would increase the age to age 75.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
In Senate legislation. So, and that Senate legislation would take it to age 75 by year 2025. So that was the first big change. A smaller change, but an important one, was to allow the portability of lifetime income investments that are held in a DC plan, like a 457B or a 403B. The plan decides not to offer that. So what does the participant do? Do they have to cash out of it? Congress provided that you can move those investments to a different account, not pay a penalty. So that's a permissive provision, very important one, though, for those who hold those kinds of investments. There was also a birth and adoptions penalty-free distribution, so a $5,000 per spouse ability to take a distribution penalty-free, again, upon the birth or adoption of a child, and within 12 months of that becoming final. There was a provision that provided a roadmap, a very bullet-type provision for those plans that were terminating 403B plans. So just be aware that that is in there as well. And then as part of the effort to pay for the SECURE Act, inherited accounts. So the way the law used to be is that you could stretch the distribution of an inherited DC plan account over your life. Congress didn't like that. Congress felt that was a little bit of a loophole, so they've cut that back to 10 years. You have to take the distributions within 10 years. There's a little, it's a softer approach for governmental plans because the effective date is not until, I believe that's the end of 2021. So those are the 5 provisions in the Secure Act. A 6th provision dealt with in-service distributions. And so that was a provision that became law that would reduce the allowable age in which you could take, at which you could take an in-service distribution from age 62 to 59 and a half. That's an important provision for plans, and also has an interplay with some pending regulations on normal retirement age, which, Hank, we've worked on for many years and we've yet to see become final. And then the final 2 points I'll make before you take it back and turn it over to Bridget is the issues that were on healthcare, the Cadillac tax, so-called Cadillac tax, which we never appreciated the name of. But that high cost excise tax was repealed. It had never taken effect. Congress kept pushing the effective date back. Now it has been completely repealed. And also the health insurance tax that plans were paying was repealed as well. So, you know, for many years we talked about these things that could happen. At the end of 2019, a whole bunch of them did happen. So it's, you know, Congress can get things together and sometimes make some progress. And this was done, of course, before COVID-19. So this was done in the non-emergency setting.
Great. Thank you for that summary, Tony. I feel like the last time we were together in studio in mid-January feels like a lifetime ago. So it was great to get a refresher on the Secure Act. So Bridget, turning it over to you, tell us what's going on at the state level. So obviously the shutdown happened near the end of some state legislatures' term. For others, it was right in the middle. What has been the impact of COVID relative to state legislation regarding pensions, if any?
Yeah, so thank you again for having me on. It's always great to have these chats with you all and to be able to engage with the attendees who log in, because this is really important and impactful work that happens at the state level that we need to pay attention to, because if we don't, changes will be made. This year, you know, I think we entered the session optimistically. It's an election year. So not many states really want to infuriate an entire group of voters by messing with benefits. So I think we were really entering in with not as many attacks on plan design as we weren't anticipating really any, and really hoping to actually move the ball down the field on some proactive pieces, particularly around cost of living adjustments. As we saw with the last recession, those were one of the benefits that retirees received that had been cut because, again, trying to get systems back on track when they lost value during the recession, COLAs was a cost-saving measure that they could do away with while still making sure that retirees were receiving benefits. But because they were done away with in some states in such a way that it really has stagnated how retirees are able to make ends meet, because while their benefits didn't grow, the cost of living certainly did. And so we worked in states across the country, in Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma, to really try to push that advocacy message of how important it is to start looking at trying to provide some sort of relief for retirees. And at the end of the session this year, even amongst all of the COVID insanity that either, as Hank mentioned, shut down sessions, put sessions on pause, or wrap sessions up early, Oklahoma did manage to pass a COLA for their retirees. It had been well over 12 years since retirees have received a COLA in Oklahoma. So it was a really great victory for our coalition in the state. It'll really truly benefit retirees who have been out, retired, being able to, again, pay bills, take care of their health care, small things like, being able to buy maybe a bit more groceries or gifts at the holidays. So we were really excited to see that happen. Yeah, so that was probably the biggest sort of carryover as far as how we started the year that actually was accomplished.
Right. So then, Tony, let me go back to you. So we talked about Secure, which happened at the end of 2019. Let's talk a little bit about the CARES Act, which came as a response to COVID. So give us some details on that.
Sure, and I'll point the listeners to two additional sources of information. The CARES Act itself is Public Law 116-136. But since enactment, Treasury, IRS have come out with two pieces of guidance that are very useful. They include Q&As, examples. So for those of you who have questions about how to implement these provisions, please take a look at Treasury Notices 2020-50, 2020-51. So the three principal provisions in the CARES Act are what are called coronavirus-related distributions, or CRDs, pension plan loans to participants, both the amounts that they could take and the repayment of those loans, and then we'll go back to required minimum distributions. The coronavirus-related distributions are up to $100,000 in 2020. These distributions would be only to those eligible to receive them, those who have been financially impacted or someone in their household, spouse, beneficiary have been substantially impacted by the coronavirus as defined by the law. You would receive these distributions if the plan permits it. The plan must enact a provision to do this. In most situations, and then they would be taxed ratably over 3 years, but can be repaid. So you see the kind of tension here that Congress is trying to deal with. It's an emergency situation. We'd like for people to be able to access their money. We want them to repay it post-emergency. Unfortunately, I think a lot of these repayments aren't made, but at least it's an ability to do so. The planned loan amounts. So the planned loan amounts have been increased, a maximum loan to a plan participant in the 180 days following enactment of the CARES Act. And the formula is that loans may be made up to the greater of $10,000 or 100% of the present value of the participant's account. Again, this is the type of provision that was specifically permissive to plans. Plans need not do this. And again, that's dealing with the tension. Plans are going to make this judgment as to whether to allow these additional loan amounts. And as I've seen in the writings and in the industry press, not many plans are actually taking advantage of those. I don't mean to say that in a negative, but it's their judgment to not provide this additional ability to withdraw your money, because their fear is you're not going to put it back, ever. Planned loan repayments, also there was a deferral included in the CARES Act, so that loans due from March 27th, again, the date of enactment, through the end of the year are extended for 1 year. Please take a look at that Treasury notice, those two notices for additional information on both of those provisions. And then we go to the CARES Act, back to the required minimum distributions. As we saw with the Secure Act, the age trigger was moved to age 72. But for those who turned 70 and 1/2 before the end of 2019, they're going to start to take RMDs in the early part of 2020. Some of those RMDs were actually made. The CARES Act came along and said, no, we're going to waive all the required minimum distributions. You do not need to take them. And then there was a little bit of a dance between the Congress and the regulators as to, well, what if some have been made? You know, for the people who are really on the ball, for the vendors who got these required minimum distributions out quickly, is there any relief? Congress has come back. Actually, the Treasury IRS came back and said they can be repaid. They can be repaid until the end of August of this year. So there has been some degree of, again, attention to the fact that it's an emergency, it's short term. We want you to have access, but we want you to be able to pay the funds back. So those were really the key provisions, Hank, of the CARES Act.
Great, thank you, Tony. And Bridget, any sort of other summarizing or wrap up from the early part of 2020 at the state level?
Yeah, so then, you know, a lot of our states entered into a post-COVID, or I guess we can't say post-COVID, but into a legislature and a legislative sessions that had to also subsequently deal not just with the economic, financial impacts of COVID-19, but also the logistical impacts. State capitals are not places where social distancing is always achievable, but it is a core piece of our democracy that people have the ability to go and advocate for their issues, have those meetings. And so how do you, similarly to what our public employees were able to rapidly do, especially folks on this webinar, take the services they provide to members of the community and facilitate that through an online socially distant mechanism only. So we saw a lot of sessions pause, you know, adjourn until the call of the chair. We saw a lot of them either, if they could wrap up their business swiftly, they tried to. And so within that, we did see some impacts to public systems, or attempts, I should say. So in Kentucky, they were trying to wrap up. They have this year was a budget year for them, and so they were trying to wrap up their budget. And prior to adjourning, the state Senate attempted to include a clause that would withhold future funding to the system without substantial reforms being implemented between now and 2021. Fortunately, the House didn't concur with their budget proposal, and they were able to move forward a budget that didn't include that harmful language, but the state Senate still took a shot at plan design, while again in the midst of a pandemic and at a time where teachers were figuring out not only how to teach children online, but also ensuring that kids were fed. So many children depend on schools for one, if not two meals a day. And I think we saw, and there was plenty of stories coming from Kentucky itself, of schools and staff trying to make sure that that continued to happen. On the flip side, we saw Colorado adjourn or recess, I should say, and then return with the Joint Budget Committee making a slew of proposals as to how to reduce overhead. As folks, I'm sure on this call are aware, shutting down states, shutting down businesses obviously took a massive toll on what states were bringing in revenue-wise. States, especially since states' revenue relies so heavily on income and sales tax. Compound that with a lot of states moving their tax deadline to July 15th, a lot of that income dried up, a lot of that revenue dried up for states. And so when Colorado returned to figure out its budget, they had a slew of recommendations, several of which would impact para and para recipients. As I've mentioned before, in 2018, there was a compromise bill that was passed, SB 200, that had everybody give a little to put the system on track for full funding I believe within 30 years. And part of that plan was that the state would contribute a balloon payment of $225 million annually. This is in addition to auto triggers that were included, where if the system wasn't on track to hit certain metrics, employee and employer contributions would increase, and retirees would see a reduction in their COLA for the year. So with all of those different pieces in place, the state ultimately decided to skip the payment this year as the option that would have the least amount of impact on the system, as well as the employees and employers, rather than asking for increased contributions for either of those parties. But it does, obviously, it's going to, in the future, impact PARA's ability to stay on track, and it just highlights again the importance of funding discipline, that these plans, and by plans I mean legislation like SB 200, were put into place that regardless of what was happening, what happens, whether things are good or bad for the state, everybody has their marching orders as far as trying to keep the plan in place to reach full funding for these systems within a set timeline. So Colorado is one of the first states that we've seen this kind of action take place. We anticipate that this is going to happen even more so as states continue to grapple with reduction in state revenues, as well as without any sort of federal aid being sent to states to help make budgets whole. Because again, I know folks are aware, but I'll say it bears repeating, airlines, businesses, corporations, et cetera, everybody has received federal assistance except for the folks genuinely on the front lines of all of this, which are our public employees and those state budgets that are ensuring that whether it's the frontline healthcare workers or even the services that you depend on are still functioning during all this. So there's a lot, I think to put it in context of school reopenings, they're asking school districts to reopen, and there has not been a significant aid package to ensure that schools have the resources to ensure they're able to do that safely for both the students, but also for the workers that are in those schools, teaching, cleaning, assisting, et cetera. So on that note, I turn it back to you.
Thanks, Bridget. Well, actually, let's stay with you. I mean, so, very similar to how we reacted after the 08-09 great financial crisis. We anticipated that public plans were going to be the political football in the 50 states. Fortunately, at least right now, the markets have rebounded significantly, but as you alluded to, the underlying economy is in shambles, and sort of this disconnect between the broader economy and the market, I just don't think is sustainable. So, since late March, April of this year through the end of this year, what have you been hearing from those who view public pensions as antiquated, giveaway, this largesse to unionized workforce? What are opponents of public pensions saying?
So there has just been a lot of gaslighting of the general public. It's already a tactic that was being used prior to this current crisis, but they've really turned up the dial, I feel, recently, as far as just putting out misinformation about what the genuine cost is to taxpayers and what the impact of funds are to the taxpayers. So, for instance, I think the biggest piece of misinformation that was out there was Mitch McConnell, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell's comments about letting states go bankrupt, that we shouldn't bail out pension plans, et cetera, when, pension systems weren't asking for a bailout. but it sparked a lot of misinformation, and it genuinely upset a lot of retirees who are not federal bankruptcy experts, who do not understand that states can go bankrupt, cannot go bankrupt under current federal law, and that would take an act of Congress to do. And so we're really scared that they, like an Enron, like other public company or private companies who went under, subsequently lost their retirements. We're very concerned that that was going to happen to them. And that's not really fair to do to retirees who, again, have earned that benefit. On the flip side, or not on the flip side, but another way in which things have really been misrepresented is, as you mentioned, we've seen economic recovery in the markets. We may not have seen it as far as with jobs and folks going back to work, but the markets have recovered. We had a really bad month in March. I think everybody's aware of that. Everybody watched what happened, but the markets did recover. They didn't end the fiscal year. They ended the fiscal year up when I think folks thought it was going to be much worse, but a lot of our opponents have cherry picked that March data as a way to show that pension funds in particular cannot invest their way out long term, as they like to say. And that couldn't be further from the truth. These systems have are weathering a second economic crisis in 12 years time, 10 years time, and they're still able to make ends meet. We had, quote, pension experts railing that systems like in Boston or Philadelphia were going to be bankrupt within these past few years, and that didn't happen. So I think it's really imperative that we're trying to get out in front of this information, because people use it to fearmonger, not just the general public for thinking that their taxes are going to go up because of pensions, but also public employees themselves. Public employees, I've seen some of the headlines that say how education pensions are not going to be sustainable, and that cost is going to be borne by teachers who are already not making enough to make ends meet as a beginning educator. So there's just a lot of misinformation and gaslighting occurring by our opponents that really needs to be countered by a multitude of voices.
All right, thanks, Bridget. Tony, let me switch over to you and talk about here in Washington, D.C. What do you expect from Congress for the balance of 2020? Do you anticipate any other COVID-19 packages coming down before elections or even after the elections?
Right. I mean, that's a good question. After the elections, are we hopefully through this crisis or not? But I think certainly before the election, we're going to have the next generation of COVID legislation, which we'll call COVID 4.0, because it'll be the fourth major version of some effort by Congress to help, some effort by Congress and signed by the president. The House has already passed the HEROES Act in May. That was a $3.5 trillion bill, which included significant aid for states and localities, to go back to what Bridget was saying, and aid that would be unfettered. So aid that could be used to replace general revenue. That's very important, because right now they feel that their hands are tied as to what they can use this money for. So that's the House version. And it was also very, very heavy on assistance to first responders and, of course, healthcare providers. The Senate, as you know, Bridget talked about McConnell's famous line, I'd rather see states go bankrupt than bail out their past mistakes, and particularly on pensions. But they've softened, and I thought they would soften. And because this is not a blue state, red state issue, this is a national issue. And now we see what's going on in Texas. And Texas, well, you might look at recent polls and say Texas may be becoming purple, but I'm going to wait to see that with my own eyes. But things are happening in the country, and senators of both parties are taking notice of this. So McConnell and his team, only GOP at this point, are putting together the next COVID 4.0 bill. From what we can gather, and nothing is final, it would be about $1 trillion instead of 3.5 trillion that the House passed. It would include some rebate checks for lower income households, so another round of checks from the Treasury. It would include some scaled back version of supplemental insurance, unemployment insurance. It would include liability protections for businesses and employers. This is a very controversial issue, as are the others that I've talked about. Dollars for the hospitality industry. And then the big question is, what portion of this trillion, or are there more numbers that come after the trillion, will go to states and localities? And that's a very big issue. And I don't see, Hank, Bridget, in this, Congress is going to come back next week, and members on the Republican side are seeing some very soft poll numbers, even in some recently traditionally very red states. And I don't think they're going to want to go back to those states in August and then stay there through most of September and October running for re-election. And I'm empty-handed as to the serious needs that these communities are facing. So I don't see how this moves in lockstep. The president, always a wild card, has been fairly, he said a lot of different things about this subject as well, but I think he's closer to sending money out to states and localities than McConnell is. But McConnell will be softened up by his own colleagues when they come back and they say, look, I'm even in the polls at best. So I think we need to buckle down and do some things that are serious. So we're going to see this kind of take shape, Hank and Bridget, in the next couple weeks. Like I said, Congress coming back physically. The House will come back next week. It's going to be very interesting. It could well go into August. Traditionally they like to start their August recess on August 1st or close to. This could go past that date, but this will be a huge deal. And I think the last one prior to the election. I don't expect a lot of legislative activity in September or October.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tony. And Bridget, then again, at the state and local level, what can systems do on the near term and the long term to educate policymakers about their funds so that they're less susceptible to the gaslighting that our opponents may be trying to muddy the waters with?
Yeah, so I think there's a range of activities at our disposal now that can be useful to ensuring that policymakers are getting the right information. I think I've mentioned this before in a variety of forums, but lawmakers are economic experts when it comes to the budget, when it comes to public finance. And then I think assume that they're economic experts as well when it comes to pensions, and don't realize that it's a very different beast. There's no other piece of a state budget that's pre-funded. And that is a sophisticated financial calculation that needs to be considered, because there are so many different pieces that go into that. So I think it's important that if you can do a webinar that walks through how COVID has impacted the system for current and potential future lawmakers, I think that's helpful. You're getting the information from the horse's mouth, because on the flip side, there will always be, as I mentioned with our other opponents, there will always be people out there who will state fact for you, whether it's right or wrong. If you need an example of how impactful giving presentations can be, I would encourage you to find the committee hearing that Paul from the Arizona State Retirement System attended and presented at this past spring prior to COVID. And he walked through a group of lawmakers from both sides through the system and answered all of their questions efficiently and knowledgeably, and really took the air out of the room when reason tried to step up and insert itself as an expert. And reason constantly goes after ASRS because for reasons I cannot explain, I do not know, but you know, Paul being able to stand up and show this is the plan, these are our goals, this is how we set out to achieve it, this is how we absorb when bad things happen, and this is how we absorb when good things happen. I think another way in which we can advocate too is that, you know, again, we've got the general public, we've got the press who have now also, everyone knows how the economy works, and that is getting people back to work because they need, and getting people to spend money. Well, there's no bigger spender within the state than a pension system. You distribute billions of dollars within your state that goes directly into the pockets of retirees. And I don't think I've seen a system out there where less than 80% of the distributions go out of state. That's in-state money that's being spent at local businesses. And so I think when we see the popularity of something like the stimulus checks that went out, the $1,200 for families, it's important to remind folks that this is something that retirees try to do each and every day in your states. Looking at also the research coming out of NCPERS about the tax impacts of the system's investments themselves. Those are dollars that aren't going away. Those are actually really needed dollars when systems are investing that go and feed state and local revenue coffers. I think, and then anything additionally that can be sort of even just boiling down what a pension is for folks, so they have just, I think, a better understanding of what people are really walking away with. I don't think a corrections officer in Kansas, a teacher in Kentucky, they're not the millionaires or billionaires that people, I think, assume or think they set out to be. It is a modest benefit, and I think that's really important to remind them of. So.
Great, thanks, Bridget. Tony, you've mentioned or alluded to that there is a national election in November. So what have the Democratic presumptive nominee, Joe Biden, said about retirement? What are his policies? And what are the assumed policies if Trump gets a second term?
The second question is maybe the easiest because it's so open-ended. And President Trump has struggled to articulate what his priorities will be if elected to a second term. He struggled, I think, across the board. You know, retirement policy for Republicans, I think generally, it's not a partisan statement, kind of can come down the list unless it's purely tax related. So I just don't have a handle, and I don't think there's anything from the administration or from the Trump campaign to shed light on where he would go. I don't, from what I've seen for 3.5 years, he hasn't been leading the charge. You know, he hasn't been gaslighting, I'd say that, about public pension plans. He has, I don't even know if he's retweeted something that was erroneous on public pension plans or inflammatory. So, I mean, we take that as a very small victory. I don't suspect that would change in a second term. Joe Biden has said quite a bit. And you look at it from a kind of big buckets of issues. Social Security will be, if elected, I think Biden's first priority in the retirement world. And he's talked about shoring up the funding, potentially doing away with the wage cap, which is set at $132,900 today. So earned wages over that amount are not taxed by Social Security portion of the FICA tax. Medicare has no wage cap, but Social Security has a wage cap. Important to our community, Biden has talked about repealing both WEP and GPO. Whether you can get the full repeal of each or both, I don't know. But to have him talking about that and having it in his campaign information, his policy positions is very helpful. So that's the Social Security area. Medicare is going to be number 2. So shoring up Medicare again. He hasn't, to my knowledge, talked specifically about lowering the eligibility age. Of course, there's legislation pending by Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, your policymaker of the year, Hank, to lower that to age 50 for retired first responders, which I think is really very warranted. Does that creep into a Medicare debate? Potentially. And then we'll also try to work with them, and I think we'll have a good audience on things such as enhancing the HELPS provision, which is the $3,000 annual exclusion for, again, retired first responders if paid for health care. A couple of proposals there. You know, purely political note, remember who one of his first endorsers were, the International Association of Firefighters. I think that's a hugely important piece of information for our community going forward. And then the third bucket is the multi-employer pension system, which they are not public employees. We have watched this legislation over the years for potential harmful pieces that could be attached to it. But about 10% of the multi-employer plans, the Taft-Hartley plans, are in serious financial straits. There's been legislation pending. There have been bipartisan efforts in Congress. We haven't gotten anywhere. There is a chance that it could be included in COVID 4.0. It was included in the HEROES Act or in some end-of-year legislation, reminiscent of how the Secure Act was passed. I mean, it could come together at the end of the year. If not, I think that'll be a real priority for a Biden administration. Trump has been interested, but hasn't really demonstrated any real drive to get it done. I would add one other point, and that's Secure 2.0 is in formulation. And if you talk to the Ways and Means tax staff, they are preparing legislation to be introduced and a potential hearing, possibly potential markup. You know, time is running short in this election year. But Secure 2.0, which can again largely deal with defined contribution plans, is something that we could see later this year.
So Tony, let me conclude starting with you by asking, we're about roughly 14, 15 weeks away from Election Day on November 3rd. Do you have any forecasts at the federal level?
I do today. I believe if the election were to be held today, that Biden would win. I felt all along that Trump's threading the needle, and he did it, you know, according to them, of course, by design. But the way he was able to thread the needle in so many states, pouring resources into key counties, taking advantage of ambivalence for Hillary Clinton was tremendous. I never thought he could do it a second time unless he expanded his base. And he's done nothing but shrink and constrict his base. So in the 2018 elections, we saw the Democrats do extremely well and take over the House majority. So I think Biden will win because Trump can't thread the needle twice. I think the House Democrats will grow their majority, and the Senate is the big question. Right now, it's a +3 Republican control. So you need 4 for outright control by the Democrats, 4 pickup. If they lose Alabama, you need 5. If it's a Biden administration, you really need 4, because then you have a tie. And at that point, you would be able to organize the committees with a Democratic majority. But there are enough seats to get to those numbers, to even get to 5 or to get to 6. You know, Charlie Cook, the well-respected pollster, I looked at his material yesterday. He is 5 in the toss-up column right now. Arizona, Colorado, Maine, North Carolina, and Montana. You could see those going, if the president performs poorly, you could see those going to the Democratic candidate. And then he has 4 more in the lean Republican. But as Bridget could tell you, some of these are going to be very dependent on who gets the nomination. For instance, in Kansas, there's a Democratic governor in Kansas because the Republican candidate for governor was unacceptable. And that candidate's running again in the primary. So it's going to be, the seats are there, Hank, for the Senate 2 flip. But things are always going to get closer as we get toward November 3rd. But that's where I would put it today. I'm sure you'll hold me to it on November the 4th. So we'll see how we do.
All right. And Bridget, you get sort of the closing word. What are you anticipating at the state level?
Yeah, so I think what we saw in 2016 is, you know, folks feeling a bit more sure and comfortable within their own economic piece of the world that I think created a bit of the ambivalence we saw when it came to showing up to the polls. And that I think now a lot of people have seen or will see the direct impact the Congress will have on their livelihoods, as well as their state and local governments when it comes to their treatment of one example, the treatment of children when it comes to reopening education and where that aligns with their values. You know, are they doing it with the ability to be as risk-free as possible? So I think we'll see people wanting to show up for those candidates who share their values when it comes to the communities that they want, as well as the jobs that they hold or their neighbors hold and care about. So I think what we'll see is if you don't align yourself with those same values, it's going to be really hard to make it across the finish line in the fall. Similarly to, I think the point of how federal plays into this is looking at Texas in 2018, you know, Beto O'Rourke didn't win in Texas, but what he did down ballot for a lot of races was really imperative to bringing more candidates and diversifying the Texas legislature in a way that I don't think anybody anticipated. So I think those toss-up seats that Tony mentioned are going to impact as well those people that end up representing them in their state Senate and state House. So I have no crystal ball. I have no idea what can happen between now and then. You know, the bonus, not the bonus, I shouldn't say put it that way, but you know, at the end of the month, the additional unemployment insurance the federal government is giving expires. And so without an extension of that, a lot of people are going to realize how the federal government impacts them. And then we'll know directly how their lawmakers support them or not. So it'll be interesting. There's some things that are up in the air. We'll see.
Great.
And of course, huge for redistricting, those races that Bridget talked about.
Yep, absolutely.
Yes.
So quick question from the audience. You know, as we all know, state and local governments are hurting budget-wise due to the shutdown of the economy and just generally, you know, the citizens feeling not safe and therefore just staying as local as possible. You know, a number of jurisdictions have announced, you know, hiring freezes or even furloughs. So given sort of, again, we alluded to this, that the underlying economy is worse than what the stock markets currently say, particularly for states and localities, do you, panelists, see the sponsoring employers attempting to curtail the rising costs of retirement in this time with plan changes or further adjustments to assumptions?
We know that, sorry, Tony, do you mind if I go
No,
first?
no, please.
We do know that some of the more conservative pension think tanks are certainly advocating for additional lowering assumed rate of returns as a resolution to this. But again, it doesn't take into account, I think, the broader aspect of what has happened over the past decade with growth, and I think what could come back with the right policy measures in place if we can get the economy in a safe place. Plan design, I think, is going to be very hard to achieve in two ways. One, you know, if municipalities go as drastic as closing the system and you're not at 100% funding, that's going to incur costs on the locals, on the state and local governments that you're trying to avoid. Two, how do you keep good employees around if you're trying to diminish their benefits? And we know that the longer, the more experience you have, the more efficient you are as an employee, whether public, private, et cetera. So I think that these will be conversations. I think there's a lot more data that shows maybe there are other ways in which we can look at saving money that doesn't involve plan design change, just because it may seem like the biggest item or such a scary item on the budget, doesn't mean that that is where all of the cuts have to come from.
Tony, do you have any thoughts?
I would add, I agree with what Bridget's saying, and there's going to continue to be pressure on bringing the assumed rates of return down. You know, when we saw the multi-employer bill, the latest iteration of it in the House, it did, actually it was a Senate draft, it did have a cap on what would be an allowable interest rate. Of course, these are ERISA covered plans in federal statute. But that would have brought it down to 6.5%. Essentially, we were worried that that could drift into our world, both rhetorically and with an amendment in Congress. So I do think there's going to be continued pressure on that. It does raise the concern of where do you make up the money then? I mean, then you have to increase the employer and employee contributions. How do you do that? That's very painful. But be that as it may, I think there's still going to be heavy rhetoric on the investment rates of return. And then for plan design, you know, it's such a big shift to turn, right? It's like you have the aircraft carrier at sea and you have to turn it, and it takes a long time. And Hank, you and I we've talked a lot about different plan designs over the years. You look at the shared risk models that exist in South Dakota and Wisconsin. People point to those and say that's the answer. Again, maybe it's an answer, but it's going to take a very long time to get there, you know, if you started to do it today. And then you've got all the political dynamics that shift after every election in the state legislatures, and the governor's offices, and can you keep the ship turning? So I am skeptical, as Bridget is, about big plan design changes.
Okay. Well, Bridget, Tony, thanks again for joining. Love doing this twice a year with you all. Thanks for sharing your time and your expertise. And to all the folks in the audience, thank you for joining us today. Join us on Thursday when we host our last webinar for the summer, at least, entitled Navigating the Waters of a Workout World, Preparing for Private Investments That Turn Choppy and What Fiduciaries Need to Know. After that, we will go on hiatus for the balance of July, August, September, and then we will return in October. All right, thanks everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Bridget.
Thanks for having us.